I swear, I really wanted to love this game. This is a video about Cyberpunk 2077, so naturally, I'm gonna start off by talking about
Cyberpunk!
The Witcher. I love the Witcher series. I don't generally rank games, but if you were to ask me my 5 favorites on the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, The Witcher 2 would certainly be on the list. Was it flawed? Sure. Was it somewhat clunky? Absolutely. But it showed me a few things about CD Projekt Red as a developer that were undeniably impressive. It showed growth, improving upon the original Witcher title in so many ways. It showed technical proficiency, as the game was a marvel on PCs, and getting that game to run as well as it did on the Xbox 360 was an impressive feat. And it showed, for lack of a better word, guts. Guts as a developer. See, there were several major choices in that game that completely altered the experience. Part of the way through the story, the player chose a side, and an entire portion of that game is completely different. In other words, a large section of the game remains unseen to players who don't choose to play through it twice. The player also has a choice to essentially bypass an entire final boss fight, opting instead for a conversation and allowing both the player and the enemy to simply walk away. And as a side note, the outcome of that decision would then be seen in The Witcher 3. This type of strategy is a gutsy one for developers to make, blocking off entire key pieces of the experience based on player choice. In short, choice mattered, and in a big way. So despite its flaws, The Witcher 2 always stood out to me as a fascinating game that showed both technical know-how and creative curiosity. Then came The Witcher 3. Again, I don't rank games, but The Witcher 3 makes my list of favorite games for the Xbox One PS4 generation. As someone with a full-time job, a house, a family, and other hobbies, and as someone who generally gets bored pretty easily, I rarely spend more than 40 or 50 hours in a single game. However, The Witcher 3 grabbed me in a way that no game had since I was a teenager, and between the main game and the 2 expansions, I spent about 150 hours in The Witcher 3's universe. That may not be much for some people, but for me, that's an absurd amount of time to spend in one game. The Witcher 3 expanded upon the second game in many ways. The world was bigger, the story just as layered and complex, the morality of the world and of the player's decisions not black and white but clouded with various shades of gray. And while the combat system wasn't great, some have even argued reasonably that it's quite bad in fact, the world and the characters were absorbing. No, they didn't lop off entire chunks of the main experience based on player choice as they did in the second game, but The Witcher 3 showed growth in other areas, namely in the writing, and even more specifically in the writing and construction of both main and side quests. If you want an example, watch or read any of the dozens of detailed breakdowns of the famous Bloody Baron quest. Sure, some side activities were rather mundane. Use your Witcher sense to find this, kill some enemies over there, etc. But many of the stories found in the world, even in the side quests, rivaled or often exceeded the main narratives and character arcs of other large-scale games. Given the popularity and quality of the Witcher series, including my own love for it, and the clear growth of CD Projekt Red as a game developer, not to mention the seemingly pro-consumer attitude for which they got so much credit and built up a huge amount of goodwill among gamers, many people, myself included, were excited when they announced Cyberpunk 2077. A futuristic cyberpunk game from the developers of the Witcher series. Sign me up. Cyberpunk was announced in 2012, and after close to a decade of build-up, we finally got our hands on it in December 2020. Given the length of the game's development and the developers behind it, perhaps it was inevitable that expectations for Cyberpunk would be unrealistic. Although, as an aside, before we go blaming games consumers and media for unfairly expecting too much, let's not forget that CDPR themselves accelerated the hype train, describing Cyberpunk as a next-gen experience and showing gameplay features that wouldn't make the final cut. Still, even with crazy high expectations, there's no reason Cyberpunk couldn't be a great game, right? I mean, again, these are the folks who brought us the Witcher series, who showed both technical prowess and the ability to grow as writers and designers from game to game. Well, then the launch happened.
What the hell?
Lesson here is never get hyped for a video game ever again, because you will be disappointed every time. Because gaming is dying. It is. I can't blame gamers for this one. This is all on CD Projekt Red.
CD Projekt are alliance, and yes, I'm snitching since my world keeps glitching. CD Projekt are alliance. Oops, it just imploded. Yes, we must promote it.
The first wave of reviews was generally positive, earning a bevy of 9s and 10s from major outlets and reputable critics. A few were more critical, but even most of those reviews pointed out a lot of positives about the game. And then the story became, let's say, complicated. All early reviews were based on the PC version, by far the best way to play the game. No problem there, of course, except for the fact that CDPR didn't allow reviewers to use their own footage, which may have shown bugs and other glitches, but instead had to show only clean B-roll of the game in action. Or how the PS4 and Xbox One versions were so busted as to render them almost unplayable for many gamers. Cyberpunk left a firestorm of toxicity in the wake of its release. Questionable responses from CDPR posted on neon yellow backgrounds, convoluted refund situations, threats and harassment from internet trolls, talks of a class action lawsuit. For many, CD Projekt Red had burned much, if not all, of the goodwill they'd built up with gamers over the last decade. For some, CDPR might as well be evil incarnate. For others, that ire was targeted at the game's media, and in some cases even gamers themselves. Now, the goal of this video is not to litigate the game's release, the ethicality of CDPR's actions, the response from critics and gamers, and so forth. I already made a video, the first on this channel in fact, discussing the ugly responses from gamers to critics who dared say anything negative about the game. And I will double down by saying that reviews are subjective and interpretive, and that any response to a critic or journalist or anyone else who disagrees with you about a game that involves you threatening or harassing them in any way is absolutely unacceptable. I have found myself thinking regularly about how CD Projekt Red approached the build-up and release of Cyberpunk, what the relationship is or should be between consumers and the companies who make their products, what lessons we can take away from the entire situation, and more. But those topics will be left for another video. I'm here to talk about the game itself. At the end of the day, I'm a fan of video games, and I've been looking forward to Cyberpunk 2077 for years. If we can try to cut through the noise and the controversy, are we left with a game that's worth playing? The question is, ultimately, is Cyberpunk 2077 a good game? And just so you know, I'll only discuss and show footage from the Prologue and Act 1 to avoid any major story spoilers from the late game. But if you don't want any spoilers from the early portions of Cyberpunk, I'd suggest you start the game first and then come back. With that spoiler warning out of the way, let's get into it. The beginning of Cyberpunk is, well, a mixed bag. Perhaps I should have taken that as a sign that maybe, just maybe, the early hours would be a microcosm for the rest of the experience. As I think most people know by now, at the beginning of the game the player chooses one of 3 life paths. Essentially, this is the background of the main character, V. The player can choose between Corpo, Street Kid, and Nomad. These names aren't very creative, but they describe exactly who your character is at the start of the game. The Corpo works for the Arasaka Corporation in Night City, but is quickly embroiled in a situation that sees them on the outs. The Street Kid grew up in Night City, is familiar with
the sleazy underbelly of the city.
And the Nomad begins the game outside the city, in the Badlands, broken off from their clan and working on smuggling some goods into Night City. I played through the opening sequences for all 3 life paths multiple times. The prologue for each path is fully unique, and CDPR deserves some credit here, as each life path introduces the player to Night City in a very different way. The Corpo path, once you get out of the office, gives the player an aerial tour of the city from a luxurious flying cab.
5 European Space Council members are dead, while 3 remain in critical condition. Authorities are still looking into what might have caused this shocking incident. The council members were all wearing Biotechnica-provided devices. The corporation's representatives have, as yet, refused to comment. Our reporter is on the scene. We'll have updates on developments as
The Street Kid starts the player in a rough and tumble bar. And the Nomad, who begins as an outsider, is introduced to Night City by going through customs and being thrown into a bullet-riddled chase sequence. This immediate first impression was interesting. Different views of the world, different situations for the character, but then it just, well, ended. And all three paths merge into a singular experience. See, here's the thing. The prologue, that entirely unique experience based on the character's background, it only lasts about 20 to 30 minutes. Then all three end with the exact same montage.
Hello there, Night City! Stanley here with you, and we got another day ahead of us in this city of dreams. Ooh, I love this town. Love it like you might love a mother who popped you out on the steps of an orphanage once and now stops you to ask if you got a smoke for her. Every new day here means 100 new arrivals, but only half these gonks will survive a year, and that's if it's a good one. And why do these peeps come to NC? Well, to be street samurai like Morgan, Blackhand, and Waylon Boa Boa. The greater the risk, the bigger the bounty, kids. Or so they say. But you can only be a major league player for so long. The faster you live, the faster you burn out. If you don't get a bullet to the brain first. NC's legends. Know where you'll find most of them? The graveyard. Matters not where you're from. Matters not where you start. What matters here is the walk you walk. In Night City. The city of dreams.
Leading into the exact same mission.
Chick we're looking for is somewhere in this building. Probably crawling with the pendejos that kidnapped her. Eyes and ears open, all right?
And ultimately the exact same game. Once into the main game, there is very, very little to distinguish between the three life paths from what I could tell. Sure, you get some unique dialogue options, indicated by it saying Corpo, Nomad, or Street Kid right next to the selection, but they don't actually change much. The words are slightly different, but the outcomes are pretty much always the same. And nobody else in the game world seems to pay much if any attention to who your character is. Your character doesn't dress any differently beyond the prologue, because you choose their outfits, which by the way, usually don't look very good if you want the best stats. People in the world don't look at your character any differently or treat them any differently based on their background. When it comes right down to it, it's all a very superficial and short-lasting attempt at creating the sense of difference, of unique experiences. But it's all just early game set dressing. Now I want to be clear about something. I would never expect the developers to create 3 entirely different games for 3 different life paths. But if they were going to make such a big deal out of the player choosing one path at the beginning of the game, and hint, or in some cases explicitly state, that this choice would have an impact on the character's place in the world, I think it's fair to expect some things to change in a meaningful way between character types. And at this point, I want to be clear about something else. As I said, I played through all 3 prologues, and a few minutes beyond. Then, I played through Act 1 with both the Corpo and Nomad backgrounds. My main game beyond that was played as a Corpo character. So it's possible that something later in the game shows a more drastic change between the different life paths. However, I would point out 2 things. First, if those differences do exist, I shouldn't have to wait 20 or 30 hours or more to see something change. And second, based on all of the other coverage that I've seen and read, those differences don't really exist at all. Anyway, regardless of life path, I found the world immediately interesting. It looked pretty good with great use of colors when appropriate and some nice tone setting. I was less set on the sound design and voice acting. The vehicles sounded okay but not great. Ambient noises and side conversations were initially interesting, though I quickly realized how stock and one note they were. And the voice acting, well, let's just say it's not great. I preferred the female voice actor for V to the male one, so my main game was played as a female character. In terms of gameplay, I immediately found the controls somewhat clunky. Everything is just okay, but nothing in the game feels great or even very good. Simple movement and combat feels a lot like a Fallout game, serviceable but awkward. The driving, in my opinion, is just not good. Again, it's serviceable, but almost every open world game that takes place in some type of city and requires a fair amount of travel, think Watch Dogs or GTA or something like that, feels much better to drive around in. Still, despite these issues and my uncertainty about the gameplay, I was intrigued enough by the prologue in the early phases of Act 1 to keep going. It seemed beneath the surface like there was something there, something worth discovering.
Don't come here often, do you? It's good to see you, Chica. Now sit down and tell me what's got your shorts in a knot.
It's good to see you too, Jack.
As I got into Act 1 and got a grasp on the basic layout of the game, something about Cyberpunk grabbed me. I liked Jackie, the main companion character in the early stages of the game. I liked his interactions with V and wanted to see where the writers would take their relationship. And I liked the other characters I began to meet, Evelyn and Judy and Pan Am. They had interesting backstories and their interactions with my version of V were often well done. Yes, the main campaign of Cyberpunk involves a lot of just sitting around in fairly lifeless conversations.
Well, well, who do I spy but V? In my humble parlor, no less.
Ukako, long time no see.
So what brings you here?
Hey, Rainbow Cadenza mean anything to you?
Oh no, another one. Aren't you too young for this?
To what now?
Every day, some sad grandpa in his old leather comes in here, asks where is his old Rainbow Club.
Hey, looking for some good tunes. Got any laser pop? Something from us cracks?
Don't sell no scop here. You either want good music or rainbow bright shite.
Oh, Chum, just a joke.
Laser pop. Fucking laser pop. Here, at my stand.
Heard I can get some decent tunes here.
What you mean by decent? We got Cartesian duelist, Uridine stuff, Tainted Overlord.
Any samurai?
Kid, you even gotta ask? Never fade away. Dancing with my axe, chipping in, you name it, we got it.
You know, they say time is the best teacher. Used to think that was true. But look at that guy, 60 at least, but still living in 2020.
Guy's your biggest fan. Not happy to meet him?
Busaka Tower to smithereens, and it's still standing there, just the same. Don't want people getting stuck in a rut, stuck in the past. Want them to change, them and the world.
But I was generally intrigued by where the story and characters were going. Beyond the characters, I liked the physical design of the world. It's difficult to explain. I grew up in a big city, and while I now live in a rural area, I love to visit cities. Something about just seeing the buildings and the streets and the cars, there's an energy to it all that I find infectious. I thought Cyberpunk captured this. Something about the design of the physical world gave me the sensation of really being in a big city. As long as I didn't look too closely or pay much attention to other people, but more on that later. I was having fun simply walking around and taking in the sights. Seeing Night City drenched in neon lights that reflected off the puddles on the ground as I drifted about was really a sight to behold at times. The early missions themselves were fine. Again, I was intrigued enough by the characters and the story potential to want to work through them. The problem is, I didn't really find them fun to play at first. Like many RPGs, you can build your character in several ways. To speak in broad strokes, you can, for example, build a predominantly melee character, which then may focus on hand-to-hand combat or focus on using swords or blades. The tutorial here was enough to tell me that the melee combat was extremely clunky and unsatisfying for me, although I must say that I've rarely, if ever, enjoyed melee combat in first-person games. No, melee combat wasn't for me, but this is Cyberpunk anyway. I wanted to be a stealthy hacker, sneaking around and working my way through missions, only ever engaging in combat if absolutely necessary. This was the initial build that I planned to use throughout the game. Unfortunately, once into the missions a bit, I found this style of gameplay unsatisfying as well. For one thing, CDPR and early previews suggested that missions could be tackled in a variety of ways. And while this is partially true, it's equally true that the game forces the player into combat on multiple occasions. But more than that, I simply found the stealth and hacking gameplay to be weak. In my view, good stealth gameplay requires a few things. First, the opportunity and tools to use it effectively, as implemented in the world and mission design. This is okay in Cyberpunk, although stealth mostly just involves crouching behind boxes and other objects. Second, there has to be a good sense of environmental awareness. This is always a challenge in first person, as the perspective by definition allows the player to see less of the world than in a traditional third-person perspective. And because it's a game, we can't really rely on our other senses to get a feel for the things around us that we can't actually see. This challenge can be overcome by a number of design elements and visual cues. Things like field of view and awareness indicators on screen can give the player a more realistic sense of the surrounding environment. Again, this is okay in Cyberpunk, although I found myself constantly swinging the camera around to get a sense of what was around me, to the point where the camera motion began to make me uncomfortable. Third, the reactions of the enemies have to be reasonable and consistent. Many other reviewers and commenters have noted the poor AI of enemy NPCs, so I won't rehash that here. But I also found their level of awareness inconsistent. At times, I could get awfully close from the side without being noticed at all. Other times, I'd be off to the side and crouch behind a crate, and they'd begin to spot me. This inconsistency creates a complete lack of predictability, which in turn hampers the player's ability to build an understanding of the system and learn how to work within it. In all, I found the stealth to be fairly boring in design and pretty weak in its implementation. I'm not a huge fan of first-person stealth in general, but Cyberpunk's take on it is not nearly as refined or well implemented as in games like Dishonored or Deus Ex.
Good. Now take him out quietly. All right, all yours. Take him out. Never smart to leave behind any trace of your handiwork, especially the dead kind. Now pick up the body and hide it somewhere.
Similarly, I found the hacking to be just silly. It doesn't feel snappy or natural, and I found the interface to be poorly designed. I recently played Watch Dogs Legion, and while the Watch Dogs style of hacking isn't anything fantastic, I found it much more enjoyable to easily jump between objects with a button press in that game than to engage with Cyberpunk's system, which has a veneer of complexity but is ultimately an extremely limited system. I found myself having so little fun with my stealth hacker build that I actually quit the game. I said, nope, I'm done. Maybe I'll dip back in next year when the next gen versions come out. But then I thought, you know what? Let me give a shooter build a try. Now, to be crystal clear, this game is not a great shooter. If that's all you're looking for, look toward Call of Duty or Destiny or Halo or any one of the other great shooters on the market depending on your stylistic preference. But I must say, playing this game as a straight-up shooter is the only, and I mean the only way, that I found any enjoyment in the gameplay whatsoever. So I restarted and worked on a shooter build. All of the same things I like remained true, and I was off to the races. I continued wandering the city and shooting my way through missions as I learned more about the world and the characters through the many conversations. I was in it, and I found it compelling. So, naturally, I began to pay more and more attention, began to look a little bit deeper into the Cyberpunk prism. And that's when I really began to notice that lurking beneath its shiny exterior, which provides a wonderful sense of place, Cyberpunk is a limited experience that on the outside gives the sensation of broad scope and depth, but deep down is largely a superficial experience. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines a veneer as a layer of wood of superior value or excellent grain to be glued to an inferior wood, or as a superficial or deceptively attractive appearance, display, or effect. In other words, it's a facade, an exterior coating that seeks to hide imperfections and flaws at the core of the material. This is Cyberpunk to a T. There is a fresh coat of paint on the exterior. This can be seen clearly if you were to watch Digital Foundry's graphical analysis of the game running on a high-end PC, or even if you look at screenshots. Heck, look at my own Twitter feed, or those of the many others who have been sharing images from the game. The screenshots often look stunning, with amazing lighting effects and use of color and so forth. But that shiny coating is quite thin, and it doesn't take much to begin to see the fundamental flaws lurking beneath. I already mentioned the gameplay. In my opinion, it's not necessarily bad, but it's also not that good. In fact, I can't point to a single thing about the actual gameplay that isn't done much better in a variety of other games. Want better shooting? Go to almost any other shooter. Want better driving? Go to almost any other open world game. Want better first-person stealth or better hacking mechanics? Look to Dishonored or Deus Ex or Watch Dogs. Even if you like the idea of the braindance sections, which allow you to watch a scene and scan the environment for clues, play one of the Batman Arkham games. Even Cyberpunk's map design is cluttered and just downright messy, outclassed by Ubisoft's vomiting of icons on the screen. The quest log and inventory are straight out of, 10, 15 years ago? There's just nothing here that stands out as a successful new gameplay element, or even a first-rate version of well-established gameplay elements. Sure, they threw a lot of things together that had been done in other great games. As I've said, Fallout's shooting, BioWare's conversations, Batman's investigations, Deus Ex's stealth, Watch Dogs' hacking, GTA's driving. But the implementation is just worse than in all of those games, even though some of them are a decade or more old. But this is the nature of playing Cyberpunk 2077. It's a Blade Runner-esque interpretation of Cyberpunk with well-established gameplay ideas, but ones that are not especially well implemented. It's a 1980s and 90s aesthetic made with tools from the 2010s. So there may not be much of the gameplay itself, but at least it's pretty, right? Well, sort of. I didn't play the game on a base PS4 or Xbox One, so I can't comment on those, other than to say that from what I've seen, those versions that CDPR released are utterly unacceptable. But even on the new-gen consoles, a lot of the discussion about Cyberpunk since its release has been about the bugs and glitches and crashes present in the game. I played on an Xbox Series X, and I must say my experience wasn't that bad. I had one full freeze that required a restart, and one bug that didn't allow me to progress, but that was resolved by reloading the previous checkpoint. Other than that, there were a fair amount of smaller graphical glitches like floating objects, but ultimately none of these were atrocious, although they did take me out of the experience to some degree. But the bigger problem is that upon any sort of critical inspection, the world of Cyberpunk is completely superficial. It gives the appearance of being as wide as a river, but it's clearly as deep as a puddle. I mentioned earlier the side conversations you may hear in the world. At first I found them kind of interesting, but then I realized how limited and superficial they were. For example, a group of friends at a bar or restaurant might have a few lines of dialogue that sound like interesting conversation. They share those few lines and then just, stand there, and stand there, and stand there. Barely moving, not interacting, and if you walk by that same group again later, they may still be standing in the exact same place, or if you're lucky, I guess, having the exact same conversation again. And what about all those random events that happen in the world? Turns out, for one, they're not so random after all. In my 2 full playthroughs of Act 1, there were several random shootouts in the street that happened at the exact same location and the exact same time. By definition, that's the exact opposite of random. And both of these were between cops and supposed street thugs. In both cases, I assisted the cops to see what interactions would be like between my character, someone who's been working with shady organizations to commit crimes, and the police. The police actions were odd. In one, they thanked me and then just stood in place. And as Wood Hawker's review on his Beat 'em Ups channel showed, they will continue to just stand there for hours and hours, maybe the rest of the game. In the other, an officer thanked me and then immediately pulled out a gun, pointed it at me, and told me to back up. Weird to say the least. And as a side note on the police, commit a random crime in the world and become wanted, and police will quite literally materialize out of thin air. If you want proof of this, go watch Beat 'em Up's review, or go watch Angry Joe's video, where police randomly spawned indoors, apparently through the walls. You can also just find people walking in circles around the same block over and over again, or floating back and forth between street corners and so forth. Again, I'd suggest you go watch Beat 'em Up's review for much more detail on these issues. The problem here is that CDPR went out of their way to talk up their AI design, which is immediately destroyed if you pay any attention at all to the behaviors of drivers in the game, and how NPCs each had daily routines they would follow. But they don't, at all. And they don't even try to hide it. For example, I'd recommend you watch Luke Stevens' video about Watch Dogs Legion. In that game, NPCs do follow certain time schedules. They may be protesting in the park from 3 to 5, or maybe eating lunch from 1 to 2. Then, if you follow them, they at least walk to a subway station and then disappear. With such a design, I was able to at least believe that in a city like London, these characters were making their way to the station to catch the tube to head to their next destination. It gave the world some sense, albeit fairly artificial, of being real and authentic. In Cyberpunk, there's nothing of the sort. I can't help but think that CDPR ended up taking this approach to give the impression of crowded, busy city streets, of a dense world filled with people. But those people will just randomly appear and disappear, as I mentioned with the cops above. There's also a serious element of copy-pasting going on. Look at this heavyset NPC wandering with his arms crossed. First, this is an incredibly awkward character design and animation, as I don't know that I've ever actually seen a human being move like this. But whatever, let's set that aside. Check him out and then walk down the block. This person looks awfully similar. So does this one, a block later, and so on. If designers are going to use such specific and awkward designs and animations, and then copy and paste them over and over again, even if they change outfits, which they sometimes do, sometimes don't, it's gonna stand out. And it's not just this one character design. This is seen over and over and over again as you walk through the world.
And she told me not to come looking for her.
What? Why?
This one time, she wanted me to just let it go. 'Cause enough people had died for nothing already.
So, what did you do?
Got my hands on 2 thermonuclear charges.
Then headed back to Arasaka Tower.
Finally, a note on the writing. One thing many fans have praised about Cyberpunk is the high-quality writing. This game, in my opinion, is the epitome of a situation in which, if the writing is good, which I'd question, it's only good for a video game. There are some really well-written characters, sure. Earlier I mentioned Evelyn, Judy, and Pan Am. I really liked those characters and thought for the most part they were well-written. And Johnny Silverhand, Keanu Reeves' character, has some interesting elements in terms of his backstory and relationship with the main plotline. But the writing itself is rather hit or miss. It jumps from legitimately good writing to embarrassingly juvenile at the drop of a hat. For every well-written line, there's some awful piece of dialogue that comes across as a middle-aged dad attempting to recapture his youth by sounding cool.
Way I see it, only thing waiting for you here is getting off or getting off. Place your bets.
Seriously, who says that? Do you remember when the first season of Life is Strange came out, and a lot of critics talked about how the developers used phrases like hella far too often in the dialogue because it sounded like a poor attempt at trying to capture young, hip language? Well, imagine that, but ramped up to 11, and filled with profanity and sexual innuendo, and you have something approximating Cyberpunk's writing. And I think all of this speaks to a core problem with Cyberpunk 2077. In a nutshell, the world they've created is simply not believable. And I'm not talking about realism. I don't expect or even want the game world to mimic the real world. No, it's not about realism, but it's about authenticity. A game world that is authentic is believable. The things make sense in the context of that game's world. That makes it feel authentic and feel believable. For all of the gloss and shine on the exterior, which again can be truly beautiful at times, I always had the impression that the core structures of the game were barely held together with bubblegum and duct tape. The gameplay lacks creativity, and what's there is taken from other games but implemented more poorly. The glitches and poor AI and repetitive and nonsensical character actions and horribly inconsistent dialogue always made me question why things were happening, or what was going on, or even whether the things I was experiencing were bugs or features. Hardly anyone in the world acts in ways that are believable. In the end, Cyberpunk is a step backward for CDPR, an experience that is aggressively average in almost every way. There's something there worth seeing. Just be sure to look up at the world and not around at the people surrounding you. Glance, but don't inspect too closely, lest you find 14 versions of the same person all wandering aimlessly about the world. Or some floating car parts. There's always that too. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And as a new channel, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing, sharing the video, and following me on Twitter at NerdyProfGames. Until next time.
Do you have the manifest from the transport?
Of course I do. But the fixer didn't give you the job deeds?
He did. I was just making sure.
Listen, friend. We're both professionals, ain't we?